as we start to think about data breaches and how they affect all of us, we have to start to dissect what happens in a data breach, why data breaches happen, what we can do about them, and how we best protect ourselves. So one of the things that the cybersecurity seminar series is going to do, it has been doing for a year now, is take slices of all those things that are problems for us in our security and cyber lives, and start to take those apart, peel them back, and help us get a grasp on the pieces of those things. So the specific piece that we've selected today is business resilience. So the fact that you may have a breach, what happens? What do you do? How do you protect yourself? We're not talking about the breach itself today. We're going to talk about what you do to get ready for it, what you do to legally respond to it, and what you do to perhaps prevent it or react to it. We have 4 speakers, and the way we're going to run this seminar today is each of them will have a short presentation, and then we'll call it back up as a panel, and we'll start to have dialogue with you. So any questions that you have as we go through this, please think about them, bring them up, because this seminar will only be as good as you make it, all right? Our first speaker is, all right, we'll use the mic for this, Suzanne Novak. Suzanne is the president of Variodyne, which is a business resilience and disaster recovery planning firm. Suzanne has been involved in this for many years, particularly on the federal and state, local levels with governments, but she also does work for private businesses. She was a key contributor on a national level to the development of the National Response Framework that the U.S. utilizes, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, and multiple target capabilities as defined by the Department of Homeland Security. She played a key role in planning, designing, executing, and evaluating the Top Off 3 exercise, which is top officers in the U.S. That was conducted in Connecticut in 2005. So you can see she's been involved in this for a while. She knows what she's talking about. Across all levels, federal, tribal for Connecticut, state, and local. She consults on business continuity, management, resilience, recovery efforts in small business, medium-sized businesses, with technology-based services and products primarily. She's developing a private sector-driven exercise framework so that people can test what they have in their disaster recovery planning, as well as a recovery-focused model to assess long-term recovery mitigation impacts and impacts on businesses. So please help me welcome Suzanne.
Good morning, everyone, and Pat, thank you for that introduction. As Pat said, I've been in this arena for a long time, and when I first got involved, my background actually started in telecom many years ago. And over the years, I've looked at different aspects of keeping business going through various technology, like a number of you folks here from Frontier, but always on the private sector side. And in the past 6 months or so, we've started seeing so many incidents where you talk about, what do we do now? And so what I'm going to talk about today really is defining the business resilience. And before I get into the detail, what I'd like to see is a show of hands. How many of you folks distinguish within your organizations business continuity versus business resilience? So not that many yet. How many of you are in your roles are involved with business continuity planning? Great, a few more hands. So what I'm going to spend the first 5 minutes or so talking about is defining business resilience as I see it. And then from there talking about the variances really from business resilience in general to in this Internet of Things world we live in. and from there talk about some specific examples. And then the speakers that are following on have various detail level they're going to talk about, you know, from a technology standpoint, from a legal standpoint, from a small business standpoint. So my intent is to set the framework and then answer any questions as we go forward in the panel. So how do I define business resilience? And you can look at a lot of these, you know, you think they're buzzwords, right? It used to be business continuity, it used to be continuity of operations, and in some places it still is, but there's a difference really in defining business resilience. And that's really the concept of can an organization sustain itself? That's probably the key thing through difficult challenges, right? It's not business continuity anymore because there's really no such thing. If you think about it from a technology standpoint, when the internet goes down, your business stops, at least momentarily, right? And if you think about it from a continuity standpoint, that doesn't really happen anymore. When I am without my cell phone, when I'm without my tablet, right? If I left my cell phone somewhere, my business stops to a certain extent if somebody can't reach me. And because there's such an instant, you know, response society that we're in, especially from a business standpoint, you have to look at how do you build in that resilience and how do you build your organization in such a way that it doesn't rely completely on technology to be resilient. So that's part of how you sustain your organization through difficult challenges. And can you adapt to the event and realign yourself? And I'll give you an example of that. I was working with a company that was a bus company, and we were talking about business continuity, and they had a contract with a city. And at the time we were talking about pandemic planning. And in their situation, they had a contract. They said, we're all set. We've got this contract. We don't really need to worry about business continuity. It's a long-term contract. And I said, okay, so let's talk about this in this context of pandemic. What happens when your bus driver is the person that gets sick or a person on your bus? And to put it in context, it's about 5 years ago, okay? So, you know, what happens when that driver is the one that maybe they die or a passenger dies? What do you do then? Do you really think that your contract is that secure? And it was a group of senior executives. And they looked at each other and they said, no. So what do you do? I said, are you going to go after? And that was their prime contract, was keeping them going. And, you know, so what do you do? Well, it's the same, it's business resilience, right? You have to change, you have to adapt your organization. You can't rely on any single contract. You can't rely on the fact that all you do is city contracts. You know, if you take it into account the PR aspect, for example, of how are you going to deal with that? And we see many, many more, unfortunately, PR examples with everything else that's going on in the world. And that's why I told you it was 5 years ago, compared to everything that's happening every day now. Every day there's to take the human element out of it, unfortunately, for a moment, but the public relations aspect, and that's a huge part of business resilience, really. It's internally with your employees. How are you addressing them in the way of communications? How are you communicating with your customers, with your shareholders? All of those things come into play when you're talking about business resilience as opposed to business continuity, right? In business continuity, you're really looking at primarily your operations, or oftentimes what I see as a distinction in organizations, and that's not necessarily a good thing, is that business continuity is focused on your internal operations or your systems backup, or you're communicating with your employees or the right people coming into the room to try and fix the problems. But business resilience is much more outward focused as well. But primarily what's key too is communicating with your employees so they're not communicating to the outside world something different than what's going on internally. And I also see that as a big gap in the organizations that are effective at business resilience versus not. So let's talk for a moment about what business resilience is, again, from the difference of business continuity is not strictly business resilience, right? So business continuity is a component of that. It's important. In the next few minutes, we're going to talk about the various layers of business resilience, and business continuity is a core component of that. But business continuity focuses on recovery, on redundancy, and on hardening of operational procedures and technology points of failure. And when you think about that, for those of you that are involved in business continuity planning, when you're in those meetings or you're talking to your customers or your teammates, it's a lot of what you spend time talking about, right? How many of you, just quick show of hands, how many of you talk about your public relations folks, your marketing folks, your HR folks? Are they there in those meetings? Quick show of hands. A few. Should they be? Absolutely. Again, you know, looking at it in terms of the business resilience, where's the difference? Business resilience focuses on that adaptability, the accessibility, and the strategy that I talked about. And strategy is key because it's having those strategic thinkers in the room, those folks that understand the impact when something happens on shareholder value, on public relations, on employee satisfaction, on all of those non-tangible things that are so critical to all of our businesses. And I'll give you another example here. If you all remember when the Ebola breakout with the airlines, right? And I was watching on TV, probably like a lot of you were, and the senior manager came out, I believe he was the CEO, came out and was on the media, and he was talking about the fact that they had not planned for this. But they had planned for pandemic. And they washed their planes 19 times and everything was okay. And I sat there and I thought, imagine if he had said, we've been planning, right? If somebody had given him those talking points, because pandemic planning is just that. You're planning for some major outbreak. So had he said it slightly differently and talked about the fact that they had been planning for this, not misleading anybody, but they really had been planning, right? And that was the difference in a sense between the business continuity and business resilience. And if any of you followed that closely, the next day, the airline stocks dropped by 30% across the board. Why? Fear. And that's the CEO of the company. You know, smart guy, running great business. But that slight difference can make the distinction between the make it or break it, or worse yet, in a sense, how long does it take to recover? So I think when you're looking at the difference between, again, business continuity and business resilience, and I keep harping on that because it's such a fine difference, but it makes a fine variance, but it makes a huge difference. So my approach is to build business resilience one layer at a time. And the following speakers are going to talk in detail about some of these areas, but it's a basic framework, right? You have the facilities and security layer, the technology layer, data applications layer, the processes, the organization, and the strategy. And we've talked a little bit about each of those, and I'm not going to go into depth on those. We can answer any questions later. But what I do want to focus on is as you walk away from here today, go back to your organization, and whether you're involved in business continuity or business resilience or security planning, and look at what you as an employee know about your business resilience planning in your company, or your business continuity planning if they're not there yet. Do you know how you would get communicated? And if you're responsible for that communication, do you have messages that are very clear to your employees about what's happening internally if something happens? And it's all sorts of things that could happen. We've all seen a lot of those. Some of us have experienced those. My background is such that I was in the private sector, but I also spent a number of years out with FEMA as a public information officer on disasters. And mostly they were small disasters. They were and it's not small to the people experiencing it, but it was in New England. There was a number of ice storms and such and flooding. But I also had my big disaster that I went on, and that was Hurricane Ike. And Hurricane Ike was in Texas. Not many people heard about it very much back then. It was in 2008. And it's actually the third largest disaster in our nation's history because the cost of it was huge. It was behind, I think, Hurricane Katrina, then Bob, and then Ike. And the reason I bring that up is because you look, first of all, the devastation was unbelievable. In fact, where I was in Chambers County owned half of Galveston Bay. So you all heard about Galveston in Hurricane Ike. What you didn't hear about was Chambers County. And all of the aftermath, in essence, of that disaster was in Chambers County. The debris, the death, the destruction of humans and animals, and all of that was in Chambers County because of the way the storm went. What was also there was an oyster bed and livelihood for a lot of small businesses. And so when you're out there and you're in the middle of this and you're looking at how do people recover, there's also human resilience that's involved in business resilience, and that's what you really need to bring to your organization. Looking at what would you do personally. And that's why I suggest you go back to your organizations. And whether you're in a position to ask those questions, whether you're in a position to make those decisions, think about it. And see how you can influence business resilience in your organization based on your own resilience. What are you going to do if something happens? We see those stories every day, unfortunately the most recent in Orlando, right? I don't know how many of you have seen the news about the doors being locked in that nightclub. Why did they have, the doors bolted shut? Is that, for security, right? Physical security. Did anybody ever think that would happen in there? Absolutely not. But you have to start looking at things differently, right? And that's where the resilience comes in. It's not business continuity the way we knew it. It's business resilience because the world has to be more resilient today. So the framework of business resilience, now let's talk about that in terms of Internet of Things. And what are we talking about when we talk about the Internet of Things? We're all connected, right? And we've talked in previous seminars about those Internet of Things. If you were at the last one, we heard from Pitney Bowes, and they were talking about how their business model has changed because of the Internet of Things. They connect more together, so you can look at things like service level agreements, right? Are they better? Are they more difficult to accomplish today? Probably so, because we all expect instant response, right? I'm sitting here with my tablet. I've got my cell phone over there. If something's going on at my house, I have the ability to know right now. Can I do anything different about it? Maybe not. And that's part of what we have to think about, right? We're all connected, but what does that really mean? So when you're talking about Internet of Things in a business context, sure, there's things we can do differently because there's supply chains that are impacted by everything being connected. You can ask for better service or faster service or whatever it is that you need for your business to continue. But then how does that affect your business resilience, right? So if we're all connected with all of these devices, and we saw the example of a coffee pot being connected. Well, that's great, right? Is it necessary? It is perhaps if you're a coffee shop or a restaurant and need to know that something's going on with that coffee pot because it might set your shop on fire. Who knows? I mean, there's so many different possibilities, and Nancy's going to talk about some of the legal issues and what you can look at in such things with the Internet of Things and the data breaches, etc. But if you think about it, even from that standpoint of a data breach, right? We said we're going to talk about that. Well, if you are connected like that and you have those devices connected, what if someone hacks in? What if someone turns on something that shouldn't be turned on in your company? And how are you going to address that, right? Is that business continuity? That's business resilience. It's how do I plan for such things, or how do I at least think about them? You can't plan for everything. You can't change necessarily what's going to happen. There's certain things you can do, but the way, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's we saw there was an earthquake in Stanford the other morning, right? Pat, did you feel that?
Did not feel it.
1.3 earthquake. But when there was a 4.1, I live in Madison. When there was that 4.1 in Haddam, I felt that. You look at the fault lines. I mean, and the point isn't to be paranoid. The point is to be aware, right? I happen to be probably more aware than a lot of people by the nature of what I do. A lot of my work involves homeland security. As Pat mentioned, I develop national security exercises. So when you're dealing with the folks that are in the government, whether it's a state, a federal, or a local level, and all of those private sector entities that are involved as well, and you're in a room with those folks that are planning for this exercise, for the worst case scenario, a lot of what you're talking about really is that business resilience, right? It's how resilient are we as a nation, all the way down to the individual level, because that affects how you're going to respond and recover to whatever it is that might happen. Are you all familiar with Org vacuum? Show of hands. Do you remember what happened in Katrina with them? Anybody? So Org Vacuum, they were in Louisiana, had had their business there forever. And they were the poster child for business continuity, for resilience, for coming back. They were back up and running within 10 days. All of their people had come, they helped open their facility, and they were used as a great example of forward thinking back in 2005. You know what the rest of the story? They had the communications, they had their customer relations, all of those things I talked about, employee management. They let their stakeholders know what was going on. They had great media relations because they had been out there communicating, and it was a great story. And watching it unfold from a private sector standpoint, all of us in private sector that were talking to folks that were down there, we were looking at Org and saying, wow, they helped their employees get rehoused, whatever they could do. It was a great story. Guess what? 16 months later, they had to move. They moved to Tennessee. Do you know why they had to move? Because the community wasn't resilient built, right? There were not, all those other businesses, all the services that were needed, they were not there, so the company had to make a really tough decision. And they got a lot of heat for it. They said, why are you guys leaving now? You've been here, you were the first ones back up and running. But after 16 months, they had to make the very tough business decision that said, we can't continue to do business here the way we were, or we'll be out of business. And that's when all of those things came into play again, right? The communications planning. How do we tell this community that we were, it was a family-owned business in essence. The CEO of the company, was a guy that had been there for a long time, and he's like, what do I do now? He had to leave. So why did they pick Tennessee? It was a similar climate to Louisiana, a similar level of cost of living for employees. They gave an opportunity for their employees to move that wanted to. They tried to help other folks get jobs that didn't want to move, but that was part of the problem. There weren't those jobs to be had. And it's why we talk today about Katrina all these years later, right? A lot of that planning and it didn't happen. And you can't really, there's not blame involved, right? It's just that you weren't thinking that way. Who thought Katrina would happen? Who thought, any of these things? You can just fill in the blank. And that's why you have to start thinking, not worst case scenario, but think about whatever it might be and ask yourself, are you looking at those things differently? Are you looking at those layers I talked about differently? And I found this quote as I was putting together this presentation, and I think it's really key, right? The greatest risk of all is not properly managing risk. And I know questions are for later, but
yeah,
I have that slide up there.
Think about your questions, and we'll pull those together later.
Thank you.
And ask the panel. So now that we've had this first slice of the components of business resilience, why don't we look at the legal side of this? Speaking next will be Nancy Hanbok, who is with Pullman & Comley. She's a partner there and a member of the executive committee.
Any of you have been at the other cybersecurity seminars that we've been putting on, there's a certain level of excitement in providing statistics. And we've been hearing from everybody, and everyone likes to tell you about $350 million here, $400 million there, the 2015 damage from ransomware and stuff like that. And I'm always frustrated when I'm sitting in a cybersecurity audience wondering, okay, what can I do about it? And when should I be doing that? Because if I wait till after the breach, it's always too late. And so one of the things I wanted to discuss is, what are some tips I can give you folks as to how you can survive and thrive after a breach has occurred? And I'm going to start with knocking up our Pat's name tag. Everybody seems to want a technological solution. I think when I talk to most of my clients about this, what they think is they want, all right, who do I hire? What do I do? What box do I check to get this surviving a breach thing over with? Or where can I buy insurance for this? And the problem is that, as Suzanne has aptly shown you, you need to have organizational change, and you need to actually restructure things in your organization in order to be able to survive a breach. My first survival tip is adopt a written internet security program. Some people call it a WISP, but you have to adopt a plan long before the breach. And interestingly, it's the law in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts that you actually adopt a written plan. And I know we're in Connecticut, and nobody here has customers in Massachusetts, so I'm sure it's not a concern. But the Commonwealth of Mass requires that you have a comprehensive information security program if you own or license personal information about a resident of the Commonwealth. So the program that you adopt has to have administrative, technical, and physical safeguards. And the safeguards have to be appropriate to the size of your business. And one of the interesting things is they talk about in mass law, whether the safeguards that you adopt have to be appropriate to your resources. And I would suggest that no company wants to be discussing with a regulator in Massachusetts whether they allocated their resources adequately toward preventing a breach that would protect the personal information of Massachusetts residents. 47 states and the District of Columbia have all enacted security breach notification legislation when the breach compromises people's personal information. So you're not a leader if you're going to be adopting a written plan now. You are actually sort of catching up. So it would be a good idea if you brought back to your organization, do we have a written plan for what's going to happen if there's a breach? New York and California specifically require, and I'm quoting their laws, expedient notifications to affected state residents without unreasonable delay, regardless of the harm, as well as notification to state authorities if a minimum number of people are affected by a data breach. So once again, picture explaining to your boss, yeah, we didn't really think that it was, was it reasonable, and were we expedient in providing the notice? So get on top of it by adopting a written plan. My tip number 2 is appoint a czar or czarina, who is going to be the person who's in charge of managing the plan. And he or she doesn't have to do everything, but they have to be the coordinator of your breach response. That person should have the authority to identify and assess internal and external risks, and that person should have the authority to authorize training and retraining of your employees. The mandate that I was thinking you would want to include in the written program that describes what your coordinator is going to do would be this person is making sure that your company develops security policies for storage, access, transportation of any records that contain personal information, imposing discipline for violations, preventing access for employees who've been terminated, overseeing your service providers. It's great to outsource, but somebody has to be responsible for making sure that the folks that you have engaged to do this are performing adequately. Imposing reasonable restrictions on physical access, which could be badges, locks, all sorts of old-fashioned stuff. Regular monitoring and upgrading of safety measures. Annual review of your procedures, and documenting the response actions that are taken in connection with incidents that might occur. She should develop a post-breach protocol that addresses all of the things that Suzanne was talking about you need to have planned before the breach. Who's going to conduct a forensic investigation? What happened to us, and who did it? You want to make sure that someone is looking into that. You can probably get law enforcement to help, of course. And by the way, you should already know who you're going to report it to in the way of law enforcement, and to the extent that you can, have actual names, contact information for those folks. And one of the reasons that you have to be updating your written policy all the time is people move. You want to make sure that your contacts are not the person who left a month ago. You want to know who is going to coach your company through the data breach. The response coordinator should already have introduced herself to everybody at your organization, and she was probably running some training seminars for all the employees. So make sure that they know who the leader is. There should also be things that you have ready in case of a breach. Part of the response coordinator's job is to have drafts of letters so that you don't have to just stand there at the end of the breach and say, oh yeah, we have to notify our regulatory authority. What do those letters look like? What do we need to report? That's stuff that can be done in advance with blanks in the letters, stuff like that. Public relations management, Suzanne has mentioned, there's got to be somebody who's a good spokesperson, and that person should be ready to say the right things, and it doesn't have to be an in-house person. That also can be reduced to a contact phone number for the public relations firm that you guys typically use, but who is specifically ready to do breach response. Third-party claims review. This starts to get interesting because I'm heading towards our next seminar, which is going to be about insurance. But your breach coordinator should also be a person who is going to know how to do a little bit of triage on claims. Who are the people that we're just going to contact? If someone contacts us and says your breach affected me in this manner, your breach coordinator needs to know, in coordination with your insurance company, what stuff gets paid and what has to be referred to the insurance company for handling, and what do they not want to touch or talk about at all. You have to identify who handles the response to the regulators. That may be your outside counsel, that may be your inside counsel, or that could be somebody inside who doesn't have to be a lawyer. There are a lot of people who handle the regulators. So tip number 3 is keep your software up to date. You should figure out if your organization is the kind of organization where people spend every day putting out fires and figuring out when to do patches and when to do updates. If your organization doesn't prioritize that, outsource it. There are a lot of wonderful vendors who will assume the responsibility for doing that. And you can be very responsible by saying, this is something we don't have the attitude in-house to keep up with. So that goes to somebody else. Train your staff, and then train them again, and then keep on training them, because the weakest link in your organization for data breaches is always the human beings. And so you want to make sure that your greatest assets are people who are hyper-vigilant and who get it. And training is usually fun. I think people, if you can bring people into a room and feed them, they will be very happy to be fed, and they'll listen to some third party you can bring in who's not the same boring person they listen to all the time. And the person who is speaking about breach usually has the list of horrible things that recently happened, like, oh my goodness, they just, this hospital had a breach, how would you feel if your personal medical records were stolen? And information like that will usually maintain people's attention for a brief period of time. So training and update the training. Tip number 5 is include your employee hygiene rules in your handbook. I'm assuming I'm talking only to bosses here today because a lot of employees get bothered by this, but I think it's really important as a lawyer that you prepare your employee manuals for the fact that you are going to have access to people's email, and that the employer is going to want to get all the waivers necessary to be able to be vigilant about what employees are downloading and what employees are looking at, because that's usually the way that data breaches occur. Something gets into the organization because some very nice person who had too many emails to review that day clicked on the attachment. I mean, I wish it stopped, but it hasn't, so that's big. So you want to make it impossible, or at least harder, for employees to open the stupid attachments. Educate them on safe social media, two-factor authentication, you've heard all this before, regular password changes, and things of that nature. Have a mobile device protocol that you make sure the employees follow, and website security rules. Tip number 6 is procure insurance, and that will be the topic of our September seminar. The insurance is a great thing to procure, but let's think back to the gentleman who spoke at the beginning. If there is a breach, heads roll. and it just happens. And so if your board of directors and officers may seem to be a little cowboyish right now, and they don't want, and they say we can assume some regulatory risk and litigation risk, we don't think we're a likely candidate for a breach, think again, because people do get fired over this. It's a bad thing. And also, failure to adhere to at least the norms in your industry will expose you to reputational risk that the company can't do anything about, and your insurance carrier can't really protect that. They have PR coverage and a lot of things that they will help you with, but it's much better never to have a breach, or to have a breach with a beautifully planned written communication that you handle yourselves. Tip 7, I hope I'm up to 7. With proper notice in your manuals, monitor your employee digital behavior to predict the likelihood of internal attacks. I kind of did that one twice. 8, implement secure communications for email, internet, fax, data, everything. You should be in the front edge and use your vendors for this. Make sure that you're using vendors who update themselves. Tip number 9 is to use only reliable vendors. Always be looking for new algorithms, because the hackers are so much smarter than we are. They are always ahead of the game, and your best bet is to engage people on the outside who are keeping up with that and have an incentive to keep you as a customer. They're going to tell you what's new and what is the bleeding edge. Finally, maintain a breach log. Whether the breach is reportable or not, that's something that should be part of your plan. Thank you.
That was a nice segue from Suzanne. Now, we're going to talk about what you do to get started. If you're in a corporation, maybe you want to think about what you could redo. This will be a review for you, perhaps. If you don't have a business recovery or on your way to a business resilience plan, how do you get started in doing this? Joe Ercolano is Associate Director of the Connecticut Small Business Development Center. And that's a federal and state funded program within Connecticut. And it's hosted by UConn here. He assists with management of the program and supervision of a staff of 18, and is responsible for leveraging partnerships and resources in support of his specialty, small business growth and development. In this capacity, he manages Prepare Connecticut, a federally funded project to help small business prepare for and recover from disaster and disruptions. But if you're a large business here and you're attending today, don't think that you can just, eat your muffin and drink your coffee and forget about this. This is a good review for you too, because the same components are required of large business and small business. But he'll talk to you about how to get started as a small business. Okay, Joe?
Good morning. Happy to be here. I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so bear with me. But I just wanted to start with who are we? Connecticut Small Business Development Center is a 35-year program funded by the SBA, Small Business Administration, and supported in Connecticut by the Department of Economic Community Development. We are in 33 communities now with 13 advisors, multiple locations. We provide no-cost advising and other services to startups, pre-launch, pre-venture companies, as well as existing businesses. And our clients run the gamut from the deli on the corner to bioscience, life sciences, and other kinds of high-tech companies that are either starting out or very young companies, let's put it that way. But a lot of our existing Main Street businesses have been around a while. And so we're all about trying to help them stay in business, create jobs, retain jobs, and stay in their community and make an impact. We know Connecticut needs that. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about, as Pat said, basic preparedness points, how to get started, what resources we have available that are primarily as a result of receiving this Sandy 2 grant, as they call it, from the SBA a couple of years ago, after about a year or so after the storm hit. And what we do in general to help our clients, our small business clients, think about continuity and the impact on their company and be prepared for disruption from all kinds. Just some context. According to the US Census, there's about 61,000 firms in Connecticut that have employees, one or more employees. There's about 320,000 that have 0 employees, which, first thing that comes to mind is self-employed, but not entirely self-employed. So I have no idea of knowing how many of those 380,000 firms in the state are vulnerable, or we will become more vulnerable if they're handling people's data, whether it's a customer or an interpersonal, business to consumer or business to business approach. I don't know how to estimate that. I don't know if anyone does, but it's a concern, and it's a growing concern, and it's a growing concern in Washington as well about cybersecurity issues for small business. So let me just real quick give you the resources. We built a website called Prepare CT. You can go on it and find on one side there, Fortify Your Planning Know-How. There's 6 modules of training that's available to do on your own. It's basically a PowerPoint. It's not very elaborate. But we're going to walk through, for anyone who takes that, slides on how to identify and assess your risk, define your critical business functions, develop a plan to communicate with your key stakeholders, which obviously includes a lot of folks have already addressed this, employees, customers and clients, and suppliers, as well as the general public and regulatory bodies. Assess the continuity of your supplies, your supply chain, which is really critical. We remind people all the time, Connecticut could be sun shining and everything's fine, but if your major supplier is in Topeka and they just got wiped out by a tornado, what's your backup plan? So things like that typical small businesses need to be reminded of. Security and availability of your data and information, which is both electronic and hard copy, because especially when you're a young firm, you're going to have a lot of hard copy documents and data and information. You need to be thinking about that as well. And then, as was just referred to, you test and maintain your disaster recovery plan. On the other side of the slide, you'll see images of a post-disaster checklist and a toolkit. I think there's a few copies of the checklist outside if they're not gone already. Just a basic list of things to think about and keep in mind if you're a small business, and walk you through. It's almost an outline type form. But on this website, there are worksheets that were actually developed by Agility.com as a contract to SBA and FEMA. And we were given permission to use them. So preparing those worksheets basically constitutes, in our mind and the minds of others, a preparedness plan for a small business. And the worksheets get into some detail. Just to give you one sense of, image one, the first one, and probably the most important one, is to assess your risk. And it's a very simple process of what's the probability that I'm going to be hit with a meteor next week, and how important, what kind of impact is that going to have on my company if a meteor wipes us out? Okay, so that's an easy one. But it gets more and more complex. And obviously when we talk about cyber issues and IT security, the complexity just multiplies. You don't really know when the water main is going to break and keep customers from getting into your store, like happened in downtown LA a couple of years ago. That kept a lot of businesses out of pocket. And by the way, SBA estimates that if a small business is shut for more than 2 weeks straight, 40% of them that are shut will never reopen. So, things like that we might take for granted in larger firms, and I used to work for a larger firm, and you never worry about somebody not being able to get to a building that employs 600 people. And there's people in the company that's all they worry about, so that's why you don't worry about it. But we all also know the story of companies that have gone out of business because road construction projects went on forever in front of their building, and bridges were down, and they didn't count on that. So it could be anything. And you know, in New England, a lot of times it's natural disaster that gets people's attention. Snowstorms, hurricanes, ice storms, whatever. Cyber's a whole new world. And communicating that to small businesses and helping them understand that you're vulnerable, even if you're a gateway to a larger company, you're still vulnerable, is really the challenge. So that when you sit down, even with the risk assessment part of this, the earlier worksheet, you incorporate as many voices as possible. And I think Suzanne or someone mentioned that earlier. Get other people around the table to provide input and perspective, because not one person will ever think about everything that could possibly happen in terms of risk assessment, or everyone that needs to hear about your message. And then hone your message in advance, because everyone has been, or maybe not everyone has been in that situation, but you've all seen people who are at a scene of something and the media sticks a microphone in your face and says, when are you going to reopen? What's going on? How many people are impacted? What are you going to do? And you don't know, because you're not prepared for that. And yet everyone hears that. So depending on the type of company, whatever message comes across in the media could be really, really devastating, or it could be beneficial if you practice it and you know what to say. We help our companies think about financial impact. This is just a basic, simple, you know, your $5,000 a day coming in revenue, you don't have it, and you've got to find a way to bridge that, and you're paying 2% interest for some period of time. It adds up. What about the impact on your goodwill? Because your customers can't get whatever it is you promised them you would give them. They were relying on you for something. It could be a bakery and you got a wedding coming up and you can't get the cake to them. What's the goodwill impact on your business from that situation? These are things that we try to help our clients understand. There's a huge financial impact if you're not prepared for that. So we have some tools. This is a little bit about what we do with our clients. One tool we have is a product called Industrious CFO, which allows companies to benchmark, understand where they are. It's a snapshot of where you are, how you look compared to your industry, and how you look across companies of a similar size. And that is a means to start the dialogue earlier about your vulnerability and your weak points. Should something disrupt your business, what happens to your financial situation? Now, for many companies who are sort of on a real tight margins these days, or tight liquidity of cash, they're already vulnerable because, you know, times are tough. And a lot of companies that particularly are just starting out, times are tough. But to have something that happens that disrupts cash flow is a real challenge for a lot of companies. So we talk about basics like having a cash budget and understanding what cash comes in and where it comes from and what you're going to do if that cash is not there. Where does it need to go? How vulnerable are you if you can't meet your bank loans and your debt payments, because that impacts your credit rating? So cash is king, because we've heard that before. But we need to walk them through a process which helps the client get to that conclusion on their own, because it's important that they own it. Another tool we have, before I was educated this morning on the difference between resiliency and continuity, which was great, by the way. I'm always writing things down. Maybe we'll put your presentation on our website. But we have a tool called Growth Wheel, which is, we use it as an alternative to the formal traditional business planning approach. Even though at the end of it, you're going to come out with a business plan if you walk through this process. But it's, you can see that wheel in the center. There's 4 slices of your company around governance, around finance, around your product, and around your internal resources, your organization. You take a 360-degree assessment and you see where you want to work and focus on. And then we have a number of worksheets that are very action-oriented. And the client fills those out. We don't. So the client owns the planning that they need to do to move themselves forward, and then the actions, they're accountable for actions. And it's a great way to follow up and say, did you do your homework? Did you work on your plan? And you know, people get busy, and small business people, nobody's busier than they are, except moms. But you know, you gotta keep them focused. And this is a great way to, again, talk about those vulnerable areas and what happens if something in this process, this chain, gets impacted. So that's who we are. We're available online, and we're available by phone. And I would just mention that if you're going to get hit by a bus, try to make it one with our phone number on it. So you can call us right away. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was very helpful. Joe talked about customer confidence and doing things right. If you ever want an example of how this plays out and how it can actually help a company, look at the Johnson & Johnson Tylenol disaster and how they handled that. That's when some perpetrator poisoned a Tylenol and went out on the drugstore shelves, really affected a number of people. That was absolutely one of the stellar cases in American history of how you should handle a disaster. Now, it cost them a lot of money to do, but if they hadn't done it, it would have cost them a lot more. So you might want to look that up sometime, just for your own edification. Oops. Our next speaker is Matt Kozlowski. Matt is the Director of Technology for Kelser Corporation. Actually, Kelser Technology, sorry. And Matt is going to talk to you about when you do your planning, what do you really do? What is your company about so that you plan it correctly? A number of years ago, I did the first risk assessment and business continuity plan for Microsoft. And at the time, it was during the time when CDs were still sent out with software, and we had trouble convincing Microsoft that it really wasn't a software house, it was a manufacturing company. Once they got that through their heads, and actually they outsourced all of their manufacturing because they didn't want to be a manufacturing company anymore, but they realized how important their manufacturing facility was to them, and without it, even though they could go without revenue for quite a while, they couldn't go without revenue forever. So they had to figure out what they really were and what their strategy was going forward, or what it should be. Matt's going to talk to us about making sure we're planning for the right things. Matt?
Thank you, Justice Elizabeth. Thank you, Pat. So hello, and thank you for having me here. It's really an honor to speak in front of you all today. I'm personally committed to helping organizations improve their security posture because it really helps all organizations grow, allowing each other to securely conduct business with each other, grow, maintain reputation, profitability, and organizational stability. So today we're going to talk about data protection and things kind of along those lines, and why it's important to your business. If there's one thing to take away from this part of the discussion, it's this, and I'll give it to you in two parts. The first part is today's cybersecurity threats. One we'll talk about in a little bit of detail is ransomware today are real. And number two, the most important part is there's actually something you can do about it. So, what is your business? Maybe you make things, maybe you test things, maybe you educate people, maybe you provide consulting services. I think the interesting thing is when we get really specific about it, a lot of people talk about what they do as if it's their business, but that's not really the business. So I'll talk about Kelser, for example, because it's close to home. So if someone says, oh, well, what do you do? So we provide technology solutions that solve business problems. So that's what we do, but that's not really our business, I would say. I would say our business is, it's collateral, it's an ERP system, it's information that we have about all of our customers. It's maintaining information about events like this. Who came? Who did we talk to? There's a lot of information we have, and I think that's really our business, and that's what's super important to protect. I think we're not unique in that. I think most people have information that really makes up the core of what makes their own business unique, and that's what needs to be protected. So maybe there kind of in lies the problem. Maybe it's human nature, but I see a lot of people talking about protecting what they do. So maybe there's a machine that does something and it costs like $10 million, and we invested all this stuff in protecting this machine so we can do our job. But sometimes when we talk about the information and like the core of what makes a business unique, protecting that information and making sure it's available and defended is left maybe by the wayside. So kind of bookmark that, if you will. We'll come back to that and tie that together. I'm going to spend just like a couple minutes and talk about ransomware. Has anyone in the audience been impacted by ransomware? Okay. I think it's more than one person, but that's okay. So are folks familiar with ransomware at the very least? Yeah. Okay, good. So light recap. So it's malware. You can think of it kind of like a virus that would infect your system. Usually uses some kind of strong encryption to kind of scramble your data, and cyber criminals hold the key to unscramble that data hostage for some sort of ransom. Usually these attacks come on systems through a phishing attack, so they're tricking users into installing something. Maybe it's a malicious email attachment, or maybe they were tricked into browsing to a particular website. User runs the code, that spreads through your environment, encrypts your data, it's unusable. And of course, they want you to pay up. So a question I get asked often is does paying them even work? Like, should that actually be part of my plan? Like, should I reserve money to pay for cyber crime? And I would say it works sometimes, but ethically and responsibly, I think we all need to understand that paying criminals like that just perpetuates this, and it raises the stakes going forward. So what you really need is a plan to deal with this, and that's what I really like about this session today. Is like it's all about planning and preparing yourself for something that is probably going to happen to you. So speaking of plans, if one of your users called you today, or your admin called you today and said, "Hey, we have a big problem. Someone can't get to this file," but it's not just one file. It seems like no one can get here. Like, what would you actually do? If someone called you like right this second, do you actually have a plan in place? Do you know what you would do if that were to happen? Maybe you would pay up. I mean, I know some people who have weighed the kind of pros and cons, and paying up sounds like an interesting option at times, especially if you don't have a solid backup. So going kind of back to what I talked about initially about protecting your business and considering your business more as information than what you do. And ransomware, as a threat, how do you really protect your data and give yourself a fighting chance going forward? So I think that all starts with having a solid backup. So this is just good old-fashioned backup. Today's backup systems are relatively sophisticated, fairly easy to use. I think looking back, I see people today a little more lax actually in backup practices than they were years and years ago. So, years ago, like in the mid-90s, I actually changed tapes and did backups for an insurance agency, okay? So this agency had one server. It was not very redundant. There certainly wasn't anything like cloud or clustering or anything like that available at the time. But what was interesting was I did the backups and the tape swaps, but about 4 or 5, maybe 6 other people in that office of about 20 people could also do that too. They knew what to do. And not only did people know what to do with the tapes, know what to do with the backup process, I'm sorry, they knew what to do with the tapes, and they knew how to do backup checks the next morning. So like that was actually built into the fabric of this really small insurance agency at the time. And it was important because that server might go down. So maybe over time our systems have gotten a lot more reliable, and you know, people tend to start seeing backup and data protection as maybe not so critical as it was, but now that, especially with cybercrime and especially with a threat like ransomware, having a solid backup really is your way out. So when you consider like backup and protecting your data as a strategy, there's a couple things involved. It's not quite as simple as just backing things up. So a couple kind of points and things to consider along the way. So testing, have you tested or restored your data? Do you know that your data is restorable? If your data was restored, you say, okay, well fantastic, I have file A, B, and C, great, I can restore it. Are you doing any kind of integrity checks to know that A, B, and C are exactly A, B, and C on the platform, and that is what you intended to back up, and you can restore the actual information available? Then we talk about retention policies. Sometimes you don't know when you've been infected. Maybe something's been sitting on your system for a while, and now you need to go kind of back in time. So when you talk about retention policies and how you're archiving data and managing it, maybe it's yearly, monthly, hourly, I don't know. It really depends on the internal policies of how you handle information, and to some extent maybe the capabilities of the system that you have. This one can be often overlooked. I'm going to talk about usability. So in terms of backup systems that are out there and ways to protect your data, things are pretty simple, but they can also be really, really complicated. And I see the really, really complicated systems can be feature-rich, but if no one knows how to use it, and you can't quickly recover and use that system to bring yourself back to a good state, that can be a problem too. There's another consideration, especially if you're in the restoration scenario. I've been crypto-lockered, and I'm bringing data back. Have you talked with your admins? Do you have a plan in place to make sure that your admins aren't going to overwrite any kinds of digital forensic evidence that you would want to protect if you wanted to pursue legal action or wanted to talk to the FBI or something along those lines? It's really important, even when you're restoring service, to be cognizant of protecting any kind of forensic evidence along the way there. There's other strategies you can use to protect yourself from ransomware and whatnot, but I think having a solid backup solution is really one of the best ways and easiest ways really to protect yourself. Not only are you with systems today, and actually it's interesting that Datto is a sponsor of this, so Datto has a really interesting solution story. But a lot of systems, there's included not only do local backup, but it's local backup, local availability for servers and information, and then it's vaulted to the cloud too, or vaulted across campus if that's something you want to do too. So it kind of maintains the spirit of the old-fashioned backup tapes and off-siting and all that, but in a more automated and probably reliable fashion. So in closing, there's the one thing to keep in mind is ransomware threats and threats really to your information in business are real, and the second point of that is there's something you can do about it. So thank you.